We're continuing our study of Messianic Prophecy, and we've been looking at Isaiah the prophet and some of the prophecies related to the coming of Christ there in the book of Isaiah. Today we're going to go ahead to a time that is referred to as the exilic period and looking at prophecies relating to the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Especially today we're going to be talking about the new covenant promise that Jeremiah prophesied in chapter 31. First of all, I want to do a little introduction into what has happened in the world at this time as we open up the pages of the book of Jeremiah. The book of Isaiah had been concerned about the 8th century and the period of the Assyrian threat, and several of the Messianic prophecies related to that threat, having to do with the invasion of Sennacherib and some of the circumstances even surrounding the virgin birth prophecy in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. The Assyrian Empire eventually fell. 612 BC, the kingdom or the city of Nineveh fell to the Babylonians and the Medes, a coalition of nations. There was a brief period where some of the Assyrians were able to flee to the west and actually went up to the area called Haran, where many years before Abraham and his family had sojourned before they went into Canaan. At Haran, the Assyrians held out for a few years until 609 BC. And in 609 BC, the Assyrian Empire finally ended there at Haran. And this was in connection with, again, the Babylonians and the Medes. While at Haran, the Egyptians actually had come to help, and realizing that although Assyria had been their mortal enemy, now it was important to bolster Assyria to try to withstand the new threat, and that was the Babylonian Empire. Well, in 609, Assyria fell, and this brings us to the time of the prophet Jeremiah. And we read in Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 2, that Jeremiah began to prophesy, to proclaim the word of the Lord in the 13th year of the reign of Josiah. And Josiah reigned from 604 to 609, so about 627 BC. And in fact, Josiah dies. He's killed by Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, in connection with the Egyptian march up to the Euphrates River to help out in the final stand of the Assyrian Empire. But in 627 BC, then, Jeremiah begins his prophetic ministry. I've listed some key events for us here as we think about some of the deportations, some of the times when the Babylonians actually come into Judah and take captives away. The first date, 605 BC, and that represents the date in which Daniel went into captivity. He and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. 605 BC, Daniel goes into captivity. In some ways, that might be viewed as the beginning of the 70 years of captivity that Jeremiah prophesies in chapter 25 and in chapter 29. A second deportation came in 597. Josiah's successors, Jehoahaz and Jehoiakim, reigned for a time, and Jehoiakim finally rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar began his rule in 605. But in 597, Jehoiakim rebelled, and Nebuchadnezzar's armies came to punish him. Along the way, though, Jehoiakim died, and when Nebuchadnezzar got to Jerusalem, Jehoiakim's son, Jehoiakim, that's spelled C-H-I-N, Jehoiakim is usually spelled K-I-M, Jehoiakim, the son of Jehoiakim, was on the throne. Jehoiakim apparently felt that if he walked out of the city and surrendered to the Babylonians, that Nebuchadnezzar would treat him kindly, maybe a slap on the wrist, and send him back home, recognizing that it was not Jehoiakim that had rebelled, but his father Jehoiakim. That did not take place. Instead, Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiakim into captivity in the year 597, and he remained there in captivity until his death roughly some 37 years later. Along with Jehoiakim in 597, Ezekiel the prophet went into captivity. And so we have Daniel going in 605 and Ezekiel going into captivity in 597. And in the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel dates his life and ministry to the exile of Jehoiakim in 597. Ezekiel begins his prophetic ministry, he says in chapter 1 there, in the 5th year of Jehoiakim's exile, which was 592. In 586, Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians. The city was destroyed, the temple was destroyed. At that time, Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, was taken into exile. The last thing he saw before Nebuchadnezzar poked his eyes out was the slaughter of his sons. So he was led before Nebuchadnezzar, his sons were slain in his presence, and then his eyes were poked out, and he was then taken to Babylon, where he died. In 582, approximately, there was a 4th deportation. In the aftermath of the fall of Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar set up a governor, Gedaliah, who was a Jewish official, and hoped to establish the nation there and stabilize the economy. What happened, though, was that Gedaliah himself was assassinated by a terrorist named Ishmael. And as a result of the death of Gedaliah, the people of Judah were quite fearful of what was about to happen. And they consulted Jeremiah, wanting to know whether they should stay in Palestine there and face the music. They knew Nebuchadnezzar would not be happy with the death of his appointed governor. Perhaps they thought they should flee to Egypt and perhaps there escape Nebuchadnezzar's wrath. And so they consulted with Jeremiah and they asked him to talk to God on their behalf. And several times there they refer to the expression, ask the Lord your God. In light of their disobedience, one wonders if they still felt that the Lord was their God as well. But Jeremiah agreed that he would speak to God on their behalf and he would relate to them the message, and they promised that whatever God said, they would do. And we read this account of the aftermath of the fall of Jerusalem there in Jeremiah chapters 40 through 44. And we're told that the message, in fact, did come to Jeremiah at the end of 10 days. Sounds like this is a test of the faith of these survivors, or maybe the faithlessness of these survivors. After 10 days, the message is clear. God tells them to stay in the land. They are unwilling to do so, and makes you wonder why they bothered to ask Jeremiah at all. God said, do not go into Egypt. They said, we think we are going to Egypt. Jeremiah, you're a traitor anyway. You've been preaching surrender to the Babylonians these many days now. And so Jeremiah was taken along with the captives or with the exiles into Egypt, and apparently that's where Jeremiah died. But 582 represents this further deportation and an invasion by Nebuchadnezzar. Well, we skip a few years. We go down to the year 539, and that is the date of the fall of Babylon. Babylon was a great world empire from the time of Nebuchadnezzar down to this period. After Nebuchadnezzar's death in roughly 562 BC, several lesser kings took the throne. The last king of Babylon, Nabonidus, in the days before Babylon's fall, appointed his son Belshazzar as his co-regent to reign on the throne with him, and the book of Daniel records this historical fact. Belshazzar, Babylonian name Belshazzar. Other ancient historical records do not record that, except for some cuneiform tablets discovered just about 100 years ago. For the first time, we saw outside evidence that, in fact, there was a crown prince, son of Nabonidus. His name was Belshazzar, and the biblical text, I think, now has been confirmed by those findings. Nabonidus was outside of Babylon when it fell, and Belshazzar, his son, had been placed on the throne to function as regent. The Jews returned within a few years from that time. We usually date the return of the Jews from 538 to 536 BC. If you do the math from 605 BC to 536, you have approximately a 70-year period, and that, I think, corresponds with what Jeremiah prophesied, again, in chapters 25 and 29. Jeremiah's message was one of despair, because God told him to tell the nation that because of their sin, God was going to punish them. They were given the opportunity to repent. When they failed to do so, God pronounced that the Babylonians would come and take them away. Jeremiah's message then was to surrender or submit to Babylon. For that, he was branded as a traitor. Several times he was locked up. Several times he was nearly killed. Ultimately, though, Jeremiah's message was vindicated, and once Jerusalem fell, then God's people were challenged by Jeremiah and encouraged by him by a message of hope. Part of that message of hope is now what we're going to look at here in the context of Jeremiah chapter 31. As we are studying this topic of Messianic prophecy, we made a distinction early on between personal and general Messianic prophecy. We said that personal Messianic prophecy had to do more with the birth and the life and the death of Christ, things that related to his earthly ministry, his fulfilling of his mission to be our Redeemer and Savior. We also said, though, that general Messianic prophecy had to do with things pertaining to the results of Christ's work. When we think about the promises of the kingdom, promises about a new covenant with the house of Israel, promises that relate to the new heavens and the new earth and the new Jerusalem. These are categorized more as general Messianic prophecies. And we need to look at these as well as we study this theme of what the Old Testament says about the coming of the Messiah. In my book, Leaving the Rapture Behind, I have several chapters that relate to this general Messianic prophecy theme. In one of the chapters, chapter 3, Israel and the Church, there's a discussion about the relationship between Israel and the Church as it relates to Bible prophecy. There are two basic approaches, and you'll be asked to read this material and other things relating to this issue of general Messianic prophecy. But the big question is, does the New Testament church fulfill Old Testament prophecy, or is it the interruption of such prophecy? Some believe that the promises were made to Israel as a nation, and when Christ was rejected, the kingdom then was postponed, and that the promises made in the Old Testament have not yet been fulfilled. In fact, Tim LaHaye of the Left Behind series, or Hal Lindsey, late great Planet Earth, and others of similar persuasion, they would argue that there are no prophecies of the church in the Old Testament. They would argue there are prophecies of Jesus' coming, of his ministry, and there are prophecies of his death and resurrection. But they argue that at some point along the way, because that generation of Jews rejected the message of the gospel and the invitation of this new age, that the kingdom was postponed. That particular generation was rejected. The kingdom would be offered to a future generation. In the meantime, what some have called Plan B was added, and that is the church. According to the dispensational theology, LaHaye and others are dispensationalists, and that has to do with a way of viewing God working in very specific, distinct ways throughout history. Dispensationalism is a segment of the premillennial view of Old Testament prophecy. In the dispensational view, the kingdom has been postponed to a time after the church age is over. And we will devote an entire section and study here to the issue of the relationship between Israel and the church and the distinctive millennial views. But I think we can build on some of that discussion even now, ahead of time, and look at how this one issue, the new covenant, plays out in relationship to the question of the relation between Israel and the church. The question then, did Jesus come to accomplish what he set out to do? And Jesus came to establish the kingdom. He preached the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. Has this kingdom been established? That's really the fundamental question. And if you have read any books about prophecy lately, you know that it gets a little bit confusing. There are a lot of rabbit trails that were taken down in relation to what is the future of Israel? Will the temple be rebuilt? What about Iraq? And what about Russia? And when's Gog and Magog going to happen? And who in the world is the beast or the Antichrist? And what about the Great Tribulation? When is the abomination of desolation? And all kinds of favorite topics that pretty much leave most people scratching their heads wondering what in the world's going on. I'd like to start with a basic question here is what was the nature of the kingdom which Jesus came to establish? If the dispensationalists are correct, then Jesus failed in that mission to establish the kingdom. According to Tim LaHaye, someday the church will be raptured out of the world, and then God will begin to reestablish His efforts to restore Israel and to fulfill the kingdom promises. In that scenario, a period of roughly 7 years or so will elapse. In that context, there will be a great tribulation. Many who are converted after the church is taken out of the world will then be persecuted by someone they refer to as the Antichrist. After that, Christ will intervene. He will come to earth and set up a kingdom for 1,000 years. That's the basic premillennial dispensational approach to the end times. For our purposes right now, the issue comes back to what is the nature of the kingdom, and have the promises to Israel been fulfilled? Well, there are several sticking points for the premillennial dispensational scholars. In my book, Leaving the Rapture Behind, I refer to this sometimes as simply the rapture system, because the rapture is a core doctrine as a part of that system, and it all falls and stands together. If you accept the notion that Old Testament prophecy is fulfilled in the church, and that promises made to Israel are fulfilled through the church, then the rationale for a separate rapture of the church basically disappears. And LaHaye and Lindsay and others all acknowledge that the key argument for a separate rapture of the church is the notion that God has a special plan for Israel. That plan, demonstrated by Old Testament prophecy, has not yet been put into place. The promises God made to Israel have not yet been realized. If you can show that these promises have been realized, then the basis for the separate rapture of the church disappears. And so for us here now, looking at the book of Jeremiah, we're going to come to Jeremiah chapter 31 and begin our discussion here about the new covenant and the nature of the new covenant. We will then spend some time looking at the book of Hebrews and seeing how the New Testament applies this teaching concerning the new covenant. Now in Jeremiah chapter 31 and in verse 31, we read this promise, "Behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not like the covenant which I made with their fathers in the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant which they broke, although I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. But this is the covenant I'll make with the house of Israel after those days. I will put my law within them, and on their heart I will write it. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach again each man his neighbor and each man his brother, saying, Know the Lord. For they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin I will remember no more." Now, in the context of Jeremiah chapter 31, there are a number of promises of restoration. Several promises in the book of Jeremiah that speak of this future day, this new work that God is going to do. One of the overlooked passages, perhaps, in the book of Jeremiah takes us back to chapter 3 and verse 16. Because in chapter 3, verse 16, it says that in those days when you are multiplied and increased in the land, they shall say no more, the ark of the covenant of the Lord. And it shall not come to mind, nor shall they remember it, nor shall they miss it, nor shall it be made again. It says, in those days the house of Judah will walk with the house of Israel, here in verse 18. They will come together from the land of the north to the land I gave your fathers as an inheritance. Now, if you think about the significance of the Ark of the Covenant in Old Testament Israel, it's pretty profound. The Ark of the Covenant, after all, was there in the Holy of Holies. It's where the high priest went and offered the blood on the Day of Atonement. The Ark of the Covenant was covered with a gold slab referred to as the mercy seat. And on this mercy seat was where the blood was sprinkled. And so to say that the Ark of the Covenant would no longer be remembered, it would no longer be necessary, they would no longer think of it. That's almost like us saying today in the church age that someday the day will come when the cross of Christ will have no significance. It no longer will be remembered. Well, something obviously very dramatic would occur in the future to enable this prophecy to be fulfilled. And that suggests to me that the new covenant is not simply a tweaking of the old. It's not simply just something added on to the old, but instead it is a complete change of systems under which man will operate and respond to God. The book of Hebrews makes it clear that the change of priesthood, going from the Levitical priesthood to the Melchizedekian priesthood, we talked about in connection with Psalm 110. That change of priesthood demands a change of law. This new covenant that God is making with His people someday is going to be a covenant that will replace the old under which the Ark of the Covenant had been so significant. And so there are other passages outside of this new covenant promise in Jeremiah that speak to this great change that will occur in the future. Now, the language of chapter 31 is significant. It's very specific. It says it will be made, this new covenant will be made with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Now, if we think about promises made to the nation of Israel, this sounds like one of those promises. If this is a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, then we're thinking about these Old Testament nations that were divided for a time after the reign of Solomon. And this new covenant will result in the union of these nations. The book of Ezekiel will point that out to us. So if this promise of a new covenant for the house of Israel and the house of Judah were to be viewed as fulfilled in the church itself, then one would have to ask the question, what about other promises or prophecies concerning the future of Israel? Maybe Israel needs to take on a different significance, a different meaning. In our study of the prophecies in the book of Hosea, we saw just that. We saw that the reunification of Israel and Judah, in Paul's words in Romans 9, are fulfilled in the union of Gentile and Jew together. Remember, Paul said that not all Jews were really Jews, and not everyone descended from Israel was really of Israel. Paul emphasized a spiritual core or a spiritual remnant that fulfilled some of these Old Testament prophecies. And once again, we see that same type of application here, in which a prophecy made for the house of Israel and the house of Judah is understood in the New Testament as being fulfilled in the church. Let me make one statement here about Jeremiah 31, and then we'll come back, and in our next session we'll actually take a look at how the book of Hebrews applies the Jeremiah prophecy. There's an interesting wording in verse 33 when God says, I will put my law in them and I will write this on their heart. And then in verse 34, they will no longer teach each man his neighbor and each man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for all of them will know me, from the least to the greatest. Different opinions about what exactly that means. Why would we not want to teach about the Lord and teach others to know the Lord? Well, remember how one entered the Old Covenant. One was born into Israel, and males were circumcised on the 8th day. And as a part of that circumcised community then, one grew up in the Jewish faith, and one came to understand at a later time what exactly it meant to be a part of the covenant. You see, they were born into the covenant, but they had to be taught what that really meant. And so part of the nurturing of the Jewish children was to teach them what it meant to be what they were, and that is a part of Israel, part of the Old Covenant Israel. Under the New Covenant, there is a different approach, however. How does one get into the New Covenant? It's not through physical birth, it's through the new birth. You see, to be a part of this new covenant that God's going to make with His people, one must know the Lord from the outset. And so we think of the invitation on the day of Pentecost to repent and be baptized and to enter into this new community of faith. We're told that it's going to be through faith in Jesus Christ that we become children of God and heirs of the promises to Abraham. So one enters into the new covenant through a faith relationship. And I would suggest that that may be what's going on here when it says that they will all know me. A Christian does not need to be taught who the Lord is, who God is, or what it means to be under the covenant. That is a part of one's entrance into the covenant. And so that, to me, is a clear distinction between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. Coming into Christ, we become a part of that New Covenant, fully aware of the significance of knowing the Lord and knowing what God, through Christ, has done for us. We will then next time turn to the book of Hebrews and take a look at how the New Testament applies this promise of the New Covenant here in Jeremiah 31.